Today on the Perception and Action podcast, what is interoceptive attention and how might it help a performer to adapt to changes in individual constraints like fatigue and anxiety? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, I want to look at interoceptive attention. And that's what I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that the correct way, but that's how I'm going to do it through this episode. And its potential role in helping us adapt to changes in our individual constraints. So the specific paper I'm talking about is this recent one that came out in Frontiers in Psychology that looks at the role of this type of attention in shooting and archery. So what are we talking about here? Right, so broadly, we can split attention into two basic types. Exteroceptive, attending to the external environment, picking up visual information, picking up sounds, and so on. And interoceptive attention, attending to things going on in our own body, right? So somatic signals, breathing, proprioceptive from our internal senses, and so on. And as the authors of our paper like to point out, there's many examples, and I've talked about some of these in baseball and so on, of athletes that have very poor vision, right, that we might expect hurts their exteroceptive attention, so maybe they rely more on the attending internally. And this example they give is Yufeng Wang, who's a gold medalist in the air pistol from the Olympics, who has very, very short-sighted vision, right? So what is this, and is it involved in skilled performance, right? So what they first point out is the type of internal attention that we probably don't think is good, right? Based on kind of all of Gabby Wolf's work, is that when executing your skill, we probably don't want to attend to proprioceptive information. So information about the positioning of our body, how our elbows bent, and so on. Those are the classic internal focus of attention studies that Gabby Wolf did that showed that they don't work. I should point out that focusing attention on something and using that information to control a movement are potentially different things, but let's take that for, a given, right? We don't want to focus on our body movements and positions, right? So what can we do instead? How can we focus on our internal body? What they argue is that instead we can focus kind of on our internal physiological variables like heartbeat, temperature, other, pulse rate, all these kind of things. And they argue that it may benefit athletes, particularly in archery and shooting, in two ways. First, knowing these variables, knowing how hard you're breathing, knowing your heart rate may help you coordinate your movements, right? And I'll get to why that may be the case in a second. They give a very kind of relaxation kind of explanation of it. I'm going to cast it more in kind of a constraints approach. Then they argue that maybe that being aware of these things can help you regulate emotion and anxiety. These classic breathing techniques, being aware of your breath and so on, kind of classic relaxation techniques of people have used for dealing with anxiety in sports, right? So those are the proposed benefits. So what they wanted to do was first test for expertise differences. So what they did was get a bunch of experts in shooting and archery, and compared them to lesser skilled athletes, and they wanted to see whether the experts had better interoceptive attention. They were more aware of what was going on in their body. The second aim was to see if this could be improved with training, right? And what they're going to use is what they categorize as mindfulness training, right? So what they did more specifically, they had 84 shooting and archery athletes from China. 41 were on the national team, so completing at a national level. So those were the experts, and 43 on provincial teams, right? So those are the lesser skilled. They measured interoceptive attention using a breath detection task, which I'll talk about in a second. And they measured exteroceptive attention using a dot detection task, okay? The mindfulness training, which was only done on the national team participants, lasted 5 to 8 weeks and involved things like doing body awareness, right? So trying to sense how your body is the state of your body from head to toe, doing both sitting and walking meditation, where you're focusing on experiencing your breath, and also kind of mindfulness yoga, right? So this is what was done in that type of training. So those two tasks, let's look at them a bit more. So what they did was to take your breath, right? So they used a device to measure your breath rate, and they projected that they gave a representation of that on a screen, right? To see your breath going up and down, right? And on top of that, they did two things, right? So one was they took the position of the curve and either moved it forward, ahead, and time, right? So basically, in the breath detection task, what you're asking participants to do is to look at the peaks going up and down on the screen and say, is that actually in sync with my breathing, right? Or is it delayed slightly, right? So they're trying to detect a delay in the information about the breath, right? So obviously, if you're synced into your breath, you would notice that more. While they were doing this on the screen, on some trials, they projected a little red dot, right? And for that, all you had to do is say that you noticed the dot, right? So that's the dot detection task. Obviously, the first one, breathing, is internal, right? I need to be aware of my breath to be able to compare it to this display. The dot detection task is a completely external focus of attention, right? Picking up something from the external environment. So those are the two basic tasks they used. What did they find? So first thing they found is they did find a clear expertise difference, right? Experts were significantly better at noticing this delay in the display of the breath, right? By average, a score of 11.5, right? Which was statistically significant. They had a higher performance level than the provincial athletes. There was no significant difference in the dot detection task. There were essentially the exact same score, right? And there was no difference between the two groups. Which is consistent, kind of with what we argue in the ecological approach. Detecting a random abstract red dot on a screen is completely irrelevant to the sports we're talking about, right? It's completely out of context, has no information in the Gibsonian sense of the word. So we would not expect you to have any ability to do it better than a normal person, right? Because archery and shooting are based on information movement coupling. Context-specific information, not being able to detect random red dots, right? So that's exactly what we would expect. The training, again, which was done on the national group, did result in a significant improvement in score, right? Participants were significantly better at detecting the breath. I think I have the wrong figure up there. That's the same graph. But it's kind of the results were the same. They were significantly better at detecting their breath after training. Right, they're noticing this delay. So training did seem to help, right? So the authors make the basic conclusion that being aware of your breath and being able to attune to it is useful. It obviously seems to be useful in these aiming skills because the higher level athletes seem to have it, better at it, and also that it can be improved through training. So I think this is kind of an interesting finding. How much it extends to other sports. Obviously, archery and shooting are, again, I'm not heavily involved in these, but from watching things like, for example, biathlon as an extreme example of this, where you have to control your breath as part of the actual coordination involved in shooting, relaxing, right? So this might be an extreme example where this type of awareness and attention is important. How important it is in other sports where controlling your breath seemingly is less important, well, remains to be found out. But I think this is an interesting example of, using this type of attention to adapt to individual constraints, right? So on the podcast over the last few months, I've talked a few examples of how we need to adapt to changes, not only in the task constraints and the environmental constraints, but individual constraints, right? So we looked at a few weeks ago, I think late last year, I looked at a video. I talked about changes in fatigue, how that changes your coordination. I looked recently at a study of effort, right? How that changes your coordination. And I looked at anxiety. Obviously, I've talked a lot about on the podcast how that can change coordination, right? So these things are changing. You're getting more fatigued. You're using more or less effort. You're becoming more or less anxious. These are changing the constraints you pose on your task. And so in order to be able to adapt to it, you need to be sensitive to this information, right? You can adapt to a constraint that if you don't know that it's changed, right? In some way, whether you have to be consciously aware or not, that's a different question, right? So I think this is an interesting example of being attuned to internal information. This interoceptive attention can help an athlete potentially adapt to changes in their environmental constraints. So I predict, obviously, these higher skilled athletes would be better at shooting, keeping their aiming accuracy under conditions of fatigue, for example, or under conditions of anxiety, right? So I think this is a kind of an interesting study. And again, it adds to this kind of growing body of work that I keep helping people do more and more of, where they get into some of the more subtleties of focus of attention beyond the internal dichotomy. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me. You can find out everything you want about the podcast at perceptionaction.com, and please consider helping support it to keep it going. Thanks, and cheers for now. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.